I'm sure that most of you have heard already that Alexander Usyk has been fast-tracked by the WBO to the mandatory slot for a title shot at what is the WBO title, against the winner of the rematch between Anthony Joshua, former unified champion Anthony Joshua, and current and reigning champion Andy Ruiz. More particular to the conversation, WBO heavyweight champion Andy Ruiz. And the premise for Usyk being fast-tracked in this way ahead of all those ranked by the WBO, including number one contender Dillian White, the premise for him being moved to the mandatory slot ahead of them is that Usyk wasn't just your run-of-the-mill WBO champion. He was their super champion, and that affords him certain privileges, like this, like being fast-tracked to a title shot of his choosing in whatever weight class he's moving into. Now, for those of you out there that may start theorizing, hypothesizing that this is somehow a shady move, I will remind you that this is not dissimilar at all from what we saw with Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford, who was the undisputed champion, much like Usyk was the undisputed champion of his previous weight class. Terence Crawford, who was the undisputed champion at 140 pounds, and upon vacating his titles and moving up, he was afforded the opportunity via the WBO to fight for what was the WBO title against Jeff Horn. You know, Jeff Horn, who was then the WBO champion. This is pretty much the same thing as that, just as well. We saw a similar move with Amanda Serrano, who was the WBO super champion at 140 pounds, and she subsequently moved down to super flyweight. She was afforded the opportunity to fight for what was the vacant super flyweight title, also on the premise that she was the WBO's super champion. I will say, you know, for full transparency, that situation with Amanda Serrano was a lot more sketchy than what we saw with Terence Crawford and what we're seeing with Alexander Usyk. That particular situation, you know, there was something going on there. There was more going on there than just her being the super champion and thereby being afforded the opportunity. For those interested in those particulars, I'll leave the link to that video in the description box. But what I want to say is that Usyk moving up and being afforded a title shot, that bit of it, that is actually normal, and it's not even exclusive to the WBO. Other sanctioning bodies, you know, they do more or less the same thing, so there's nothing odd about that in particular. It may be to the chagrin of Dillian White, and we'll discuss him a little further, you know, a little later on, but for what it's worth, I see nothing wrong with the WBO's decision. It really spices things up in the heavyweight division. It really does add an even bigger air of intrigue to what is already you know, a hot weight class that a lot of people have got on their minds. So, you know, I take no issue with the WBO's decision, although I'm pretty sure Dillian White, he's not too happy about it. It being that, you know, he is the WBO's number one contender, number one ranked contender at heavyweight. He's got to be feeling, you know, some kind of way right now. He's got to. You haven't had any luck with the WBC and getting a title shot with them. And you're number one with them, but you haven't had any luck. You're number one with the WBO, but they decide to put another guy who hasn't even had a fight at the weight yet. They decide to prioritize his title shot instead of yours. But to that, I'll say this. You know, we know that negotiations for a rematch between Dillian White and Anthony Joshua, they fell apart. This is well after the WBC started playing games with Dillian White. This is well after it became painfully obvious that the WBC is helping Wilder stave off Dillian White. You understand? That at the time Dillian White entered in negotiations with Anthony Joshua, he was already going through tough times via the WBC. So you see that avenue was at, you know, if it was closed, it was more or less closed to you back then. But you have another opportunity to fight for a title against your domestic rival. And, you know, you want to go into those negotiations trying to tell that guy what to do, trying to tell him what kind of money he should offer you, and that wasn't working out. So what did Dillian White do? Dillian White, he decided to back himself, bank on himself, and walk away. And I think that created this environment, that move, that, you know, beggars can't be choosy. In that situation, Anthony Joshua is the obvious A-side. You can take what he's offering you, or you cannot take it. But you chose not to take it. And in you choosing not to take it, that explains your current situation. That explains your current predicament. And that's why many people would say that Dillian White is playing a dangerous game. A game that, you know, maybe down the line it'll yield certain rewards, or he'll be derailed, and all the momentum that he's gained over time will be sidetracked by what could be a potential loss to Oscar Rivas. You understand what I'm saying? That you kind of did it to yourself. You know, that Dillian White, he kind of did it to himself. If it's about getting a title shot, you had one in front of you, but you wanted to tell the A-side what to do, and it doesn't work that way. Anybody could have told you that. So as a result of that, you didn't get the fight. You guys couldn't agree on terms. You walk away from it. Now you're in this situation, and we see what's going on in this situation. These things could have been circumvented had Dillian White decided to take the deal, but he didn't like the deal. Okay then, you know, causality. You didn't like the deal. You didn't take the deal. Your current situation is of your own, you know, making. I mean, it really is. So I feel for the guy, but I feel for the guy. But at the end of the day, this situation really is of Dillian White's own making. This one in particular. It didn't have to be about this. You could have taken the title shot with Anthony Joshua, but this is what it is. Now, at this point in the juncture, there are rumblings, there are talks, there are rumors that the WBC very soon might actually name Dillian White as the mandatory challenger. There are those kinds of conversations floating around out there in the boxing cosmos. But I dare say that even if they do that, Dillian White, he's not out of the woods yet. I mean, the irony of this situation, the tragedy I should say, is that at a time where the WBC might actually give him what he's wanted for over 600 days, at this time, even if they decide to give it to him, he's not out of the woods. He's got Oscar Rivas to contend with. And that's a fight that he could lose. I mean, that's the tragedy of it. That's the risque part of it. That if they do decide now, here today, to finally give this guy that shot and give him that status, it'll be coming at a time where he could be very close to a loss. And then that status, it may go to the other guy. It may go to Oscar Rivas. Now, if at some point between now and the time that Dillian White fights Oscar Rivas, the WBC so decides to either grant that status to Dillian White or simply upgrade the fight itself to a WBC final eliminator where the winner of the fight will become the mandatory challenger. If that takes place, that adds an even bigger air of intrigue to that fight, to that card, that now there's more on the line than there was before. This may give Dillian White an added incentive to fight harder to win that fight. But that incentive, it's a two-way street. It's a double-edged sword, and it works both ways. Because that added incentive could also work in the favor of Oscar Rivas to fight harder, to get his shot on the big stage. So, you know, it's an interesting situation for the fans sitting at home watching this storyline unfold. But for Dillian White, you know, it might be a day late and $1 short. I mean, it might be. Now, on to Alexander Usyk. And what scenarios, him being fast-tracked into that mandatory slot, what scenarios that creates. That he's got a shot at the winner of that fight, whoever the winner might be. Some months ago, when people started entertaining the conversation of Alexander Usyk moving up and potentially squaring off against fighters like, you know, Deontay Wilder, perhaps Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua seemed like the more likely proposition. You know, when this was a talking point, myself, I see it well within the realm of possibility that Alexander Usyk, he could move up. He could make a splash in the process. I don't rule that out at all. I mean, I've said it time and time again. Stranger things have happened than a cruiserweight moving up into the heavyweight division and becoming a world champion. Stranger things have happened, okay, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, have you ever heard of Michael Spinks, the Jinx? You ever heard of that guy? You ever heard of his fight with Larry Holmes? Close fight, but better still, a fight that Michael Spinks won.
Fights.
You ever heard of Evander Holyfield? David Hay? You ever heard of these guys, okay? It's not some strange anomalous occurrence that a cruiserweight could move up and make a splash. I mean, it really, in all honesty, it's not. So the idea, even then, that Usyk could move up and beat an Anthony Joshua. I don't know, maybe beat a Deontay Wilder. Maybe a Tyson Fury. I don't rule it out. I don't dismiss it as pure farce. It's in the realm, it's within the realm of possibility. You understand? So you think about today's heavyweight division. Who's got most of the belts, right? Who's got them? I'll tell you who's got them. Andy Ruiz has got them. So let's say, for argument's sake, that maybe Joshua can't pull it off in the rematch any more than he tried to pull it off in the first fight. Maybe it's just a bad style matchup. Chalk it up to, you know, not having the right mental fortitude, whatever. Create the environment to where Andy Ruiz is still the unified champion after the Anthony Joshua rematch. Let's just entertain that for a second. if he holds on to those belts, he's going to have to contend with Alexander Usyk as a result. I mean, unless he decides to vacate the WBO title, that would be the situation. You understand that? You got to fight that guy. You want to keep that belt. You want to keep that brown belt. You got to fight that guy. Let me tell you something. I'm going to tell you one fucking thing. If Andy Ruiz should find himself confronted with Alexander Usyk, I dare say that is a fight that Usyk can win. I can see Usyk winning that fight. You know, Andy Ruiz, and a part of what makes him a dangerous opponent for some of these heavyweights that are out there, a part of the reason that, you know, unlike so many others ahead of the Joshua fight, a part of the reason that I didn't scoff at the proposition of him stepping in, I thought that was a solid fight against a solid fighter. You can go back, you can watch those videos. You can also hear my commentary on that fight in Dan the Man's podcast, where I discussed and we discussed how, you know, if Andy Ruiz gets in position to land those combinations, Anthony Joshua could be in big trouble. What makes this guy a formidable foe is not just his punch resistance, is not just his punching power, but his hand speed. Andy Ruiz has fast hands. Some of the fastest hands, arguably, what some people consider now, the fastest hands in the entire heavyweight division. There's people out there that'll tell you that, but at minimum, this is a guy that's got hand speed. You think about that. Alexander Usyk would be moving up into that division with very similar hand speed. You do realize that, right? In terms of physical dimensions, the stature, the wingspan of the fighters, these two guys are in the same neighborhood. But what Usyk would bring to the table in a fight against Andy Ruiz are, you know, they just so happen to be things that, God bless him, Andy Ruiz, characteristics that he doesn't possess. Andy Ruiz, for all his virtues, is not an agile, nimble fighter. I mean, he's not. This is not a guy who's light on his feet, you understand? This is not a guy who's going to go out there and shake and bake his opponents. No. You know, you might have been able to catch Anthony Joshua's jab, and that's all well and good. Credit goes out to him. But Anthony Joshua is not known for being a particularly fast guy. I mean, generally speaking, things like hand speed, foot speed, agility, you know, guys that are light on their feet, nimble fighters, these kinds of characteristics aren't commonplace in what is the land of the giants, the granddaddy of all weight classes, the heavyweight division. It's not commonplace to find a whole heap of fighters that possess these qualities, and these are the qualities that Usyk has working for him. That, you know what, maybe he's not the biggest puncher, but he's got other things that he brings to the table. You think about what Ruiz's qualities as a fighter are, that this is a guy that can take a fantastic punch, great hand speed, sits on his punches, generates good power in the process. Have we ever seen Usyk square off against a fighter like this, a fighter who can really deal with a shot and keep powering forward? Have we ever seen Alexander Usyk deal with just such a fighter? And I dare say we have. We already have. A guy who bears those characteristics, packs a mean punch, has a great chin, throws compact hooks on the inside guy, like Ruiz is an inside guy. We've seen Usyk deal with a guy like that. And the guy that he dealt with had very similar dimensions to Andy Ruiz. Who is that guy? Murat Gassiev is that guy. And we saw Alexander Usyk put on a clinic against that guy. One-sided fight from the opening bell to the final bell. He fended off that guy's power. He neutralized it and worked around him. Not with brute force, but clinical boxing. Clinical boxing acumen, okay? So you ask me, can Alexander Usyk, is he capable of offsetting a guy's power for 12 full rounds? He most certainly is. I've seen him do it before. And I think that against Andy Ruiz, I think we could see him do it again. I dare say that if by some chance Joshua doesn't come out on top in that rematch and Ruiz holds on to that belt, if he finds himself still in possession of that belt at the time the WBO orders a fight, a mandatory title defense against Usyk, that's a fight that Ruiz can lose. I mean, the most popular question floating around in regards to Usyk and him ascending to the heavyweight division, the most popular question that people ask is whether or not this guy can offset these other guys' power for the full course, for the full duration of a fight. Can he not get clipped for 12 rounds? And I think that given some of the physical dimensions that these other fighters possess, it's a different situation than what he would face in Andy Ruiz, because Andy Ruiz, well, he's got similar dimensions, similar stature, similar wingspan to Usyk and some fighters that Usyk has faced. So if the dimensions are similar, if that's the kind of environment where he's got to offset a guy's power for 12 rounds, I most certainly think he can, at least against Ruiz. It's not the same thing as having to contend with a guy that has a big punch and a whole lot of size. It's a different situation. But against Ruiz, I believe it's more manageable. In that kind of a scenario, in that kind of an environment, it's actually a little bit more possible. He's not a shoo-in. Nothing's guaranteed. But in that particular scenario, in that particular situation, against that particular opponent, I actually think it's more feasible for Alexander Usyk to become a unified champion in what would be his second weight class, what would be the heavyweight division. Oh yeah. I mean, I think it'd be easier to wrestle those titles away from an Andy Ruiz than it would be if Tyson Fury were holding them, wouldn't you say? It's a different situation when you have a man that size that can move around that ring like that, wouldn't you say? But against Andy Ruiz, he really would be facing a similar, not identical, but a similar situation, similar kind of opponent to what he faced in Gassiev. A guy who's got compact hooks, he fires from close proximity, on the inside, likes to power forward, good punch resistance. These are things that Usyk has had to work around before. And Andy Ruiz, he'd have to work around them again. Maybe Andy's a more sizable puncher than Murat Gassiev. You know, maybe. I mean, I'll give him that. He's a heavyweight. He's a full-fledged heavyweight. He's certainly got more amateur experience than Murat Gassiev. You know, Murat, he's not an Olympian or any kind of guy like that. He's not. You know, he's a young guy, good fighter, but he's not that kind of guy that has that extensive pedigree. Now, Andy, he's got amateur experience, so there is also that to contend with. But, you know, in the realm of amateur experience, Usyk's nothing to sneeze at. Gold medalist. Did you guys forget? So I'll say that if that's the way that it happens, what we could be seeing is that Alexander Usyk, you know, he may just become a world champion again in the heavyweight division.